Because if you want to use any kind of nullification against this largest government in history, you have to use good strategy. And most of how we approach things here at the 10th Amendment Center, of course, we learn and adapt, but we get most of our ideas, strategic ideas, directly from lessons from the founders and the old revolutionaries. And on this episode, we're going back to 1774, the Coercive Acts, what a lot of people call the Intolerable Acts, the Continental Association, non-importation boycotts. And from there, I've got three key elements that we're supposed to apply to any strategy when you're thinking about whether or not you should approach that strategy against the empire. First of all, the necessity of the times requires it. I think that's pretty obvious. Two, it can't be the probable source of a greater evil than what you have right now. Three, it also has to have a probability, not just a possibility, a probability of success. And plus, I've got a bonus one about backbone that I think is one of my favorite quotes from the Revolution. And it's from a guy who, if you've been following this show for any amount of time, that I don't like at all, Alexander Hamilton. But first, let's get through a little bit of background here, because it's important to understand the framework of where things were. Yesterday in history, March 31st, 1774, the British Parliament passed the first of the Coercive or Intolerable Acts. This was the Boston Port Act. And here from George Washington's Mount Vernon, they say the act authorized the Royal Navy to blockade Boston Harbor because, quote, the commerce of His Majesty's subjects cannot be safely carried on there. Of course, the blockade of the port was for safety. Government always tells us that when they shut down our ability to conduct business, to make our own personal choices, it's always to protect us. But really, for your safety has always meant so we can control you. And that's what they were doing by shutting down and blockading Boston Harbor. They write, the blockade commenced on June 1st, 1774, effectively closing Boston's port to commercial traffic. Additionally, it forbade any exports to foreign ports or provinces. The only imports allowed were, of course, provisions for the British Army and necessary goods such as fuel and wheat. It sounds like the shutdown regime that all of us had to live through just in recent years. Now, this was a retaliation for the Boston Tea Party the previous year, which was a response, a retaliation against the Tea Act of 1773, which was a response to the resistance to the Townshend duties of 1767. We can keep going back and back and back to the 7 Years' War, etc. Here again, they write, the act mandated that the port remain shuttered until Bostonians made restitution to the East India Company, the owners of the destroyed tea. The king had determined that the colony was able to obey British laws, so just total obedience. You got to pay back these people. This is collective punishment as well. I will make a determination if you guys are sufficiently obedient, and that British goods once again could be traded in the harbor safely, always safely. Now, when we hear the name Paul Revere, our first thought is usually the Midnight Ride. But he went on more than 15. I've seen counts as high as 18 or so. And one of the first big ones was on May 13th, 1774. The Boston Committee of Correspondence dispatched Paul Revere to Philadelphia to tell everybody about this Port Act. And here from All Things Liberty, Revere carried a circular letter to Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and, quote, colonies to the southward of them, along with a copy of the Boston Port Act. The resolves of Boston's emergency town meeting. Of course, they had a meeting to discuss what needed to be done, and a letter aimed primarily at merchants calling for a suspension of, quote, your trade with Great Britain. So Boston immediately called on the other colonies for support. They wanted to do a suspension of trade, a boycott, because they thought this could be effective. They knew it was effective against the Stamp Act. The prime target, they write, was Philadelphia, the hub of transatlantic trade. Unless merchants were signed on, any boycott wouldn't work. The city rejected the call for another round of trade warfare, but in a compromise move on May 21st, their committee of correspondence called for, quote, a general congress of deputies from the different colonies, clearly to state what we conceive as our rights and to make claim or petition of them to His Majesty in firm but decent and dutiful terms. Soft, but this is really the birth of the first Continental Congress. New York actually also rejected the call for non-importation, but that's where we get the first Continental Congress, and we'll get back to that in just a moment. Now, in the meantime, In the Boston area, Dr. Joseph Warren was the primary drafter of what became the Suffolk Resolves, which were passed on September 9th, 1774. They called again for a boycott of British goods and imports, non-compliance, direct non-compliance to the Coercive Acts, disobedience to some court actions, and even tax resistance. So these were really, really aggressive measures, especially when we consider what most people are willing to do today. So Joseph Warren, the Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, and so many others were calling for quite a bit there in the Suffolk Resolves. I covered that in some detail in an episode that'll be included in the show notes. Blueprint for Liberty, the Suffolk Resolves of 1774. So again, on September 11th, maybe the original September 11th, the Suffolk County Committee of Correspondence sent Paul Revere back to Philadelphia. And here from All Things Liberty, they say, when he arrived on September 16th, the Continental Congress, which was formed out of the original request that they sent Paul Revere out, they had been meeting for 12 days. Debates revealed a split between radicals and moderates. But Paul Revere's news of the revolution underway in Massachusetts tilted the scales. The next day, Congress unanimously endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, with even moderates like Joseph Galloway, I guess they call him a moderate, maybe a Tory, but with even moderates like Joseph Galloway forced to vote in favor. So it was politically popular for them to take this action, and they did unanimously in support of those resolves, which even called for tax resistance and direct disobedience, along with the non-importation and the boycott of trade. Now, inspired by this, the First Continental Congress passed what we call an early Bill of Rights, the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress in October of 1774, and it starts out with this. Whereas, since the close of the last war, the British Parliament, claiming a power of right to bind the people of America by statutes in all cases whatsoever, hath in some acts expressly imposed taxes on them, and others, etc., etc. So what they are referencing here is the Declaratory Act of 1766, where the British claimed unlimited centralized power. The British Parliament claimed unlimited power in all cases whatsoever. This is the exact terms that they used, and they used this at the beginning of the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress. So we know that everything else was an example of how they were trying to implement this unlimited power. So then they went through a list of colonial rights, a list of measures that they saw as unconstitutional. We know that there was an unwritten constitution, but they still considered measures unconstitutional. James Otis Jr., in his response, his great speech against the writs of assistance in 1761, of course, said an act against the Constitution is void. But anyways, they summed it up with this. To these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. So this is a serious line in the sand. They had a whole list of stuff, which also included the Coercive Acts, starting with the Boston Port Act, the first of them. And they said, we cannot submit to this. It's not like we might, but this is a no way. It cannot happen. And so they said, well, we may not be able to get from here to there in one fell swoop, so let's consider the strategy that we're going to use. They discussed this for days, of course. And they said, we have for the present. And I think this is an important point, because a lot of times we take small steps forward. And we follow the advice of Thomas Jefferson, who told the Reverend Charles Clay in 1790 that the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. Why? Jefferson told us that it takes time to convince people what is even for their own good. They often don't recognize it until they see other people doing it. Some people are leaders, and many other people are followers. Some people are sheep. Some people are wolves, I guess. And so they decided that at the present, but I like that they pointed out that at the present, this is what we've decided to do, which really leaves it open to quite a bit more down the line. And we know there was quite a bit more down the line in 1775 and beyond. We have for the present, if you're thinking about the status quo, as long as they don't start doing more stuff like, well, marching on Lexington and Concord to enact their gun control scheme or confiscation, well, maybe we won't have to do more than this. But they said we have for the present only resolved to pursue the following peaceable measures. 1, to enter into a non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation agreement or association. 2, to prepare an address to the people of Great Britain and a memorial to the inhabitants of British America, basically explaining this is what we're doing and why. And 3, to prepare a loyal address to His Majesty agreeable to resolutions already into. Now, that was the end of the Declaration of Resolves. I did cover that also in another episode, which will be linked to in the show notes. But then the following week, and this is a lot of kind of going through this history, and then we're going to get to these 3 key elements of how this is described as how they were approaching this. So the following week, they passed the Continental Association. This is the first of the founding 4, the big documents. And here from Robert McDonald over at Teaching American History, he points out that knowing that colonial boycotts and non-importation agreements had helped pressure Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act and most of the taxes imposed through the Townshend Acts of 1767. First of all, the Stamp Act was the resistance, the noncompliance. Of course, there was local officials that didn't participate in enforcement. There was even a court in Maryland that said you don't have to obey this stuff. So it was this kind of noncompliance with the Stamp Act, which created an environment where it was totally unenforceable. It was very difficult for them to enforce it. And I think they repealed it to save face. And they did also add the Declaratory Act the same day or the very next day, kind of a slap in the face to really assert, well, we're not repealing this because we're not allowed to have this. We really want to do this. John Adams had written in his diary right after they passed that, like, oh, I wonder how they're going to implement that. And it didn't take long because they added a lot more taxes. The Townshend Acts of 1767, John Dickinson, of course, urged more resistance to it, just like he did in response to the Stamp Act. And all of those were repealed as well, except for the tax on tea. And that's where you get the Tea Act. And that's where you get the Boston Tea Party and then the Coercive Acts. So it's each step that kind of leads to another. It's a pushback. It's one side that wants to control and protect everybody, really, for your safety, of course, and the other side who just wants to live in peace. So knowing that these boycotts actually pressured them to repeal the Stamp Act and most of the taxes imposed through the Townshend Acts, members of the Continental Congress voted in favor of this intercolonial association, the Continental Association. This was, I think, October 20th, 1774, which would first end the importation of British goods, then their consumption, and finally all exports from the colonies to other parts of the British Empire. So it was a step-by-step approach. Start with this, see how they respond, build it further, see how they respond, build it further. And I covered that one as well in another episode, first of the founding 4 Continental Association. That'll be linked to in the show notes as well. Now, you won't be surprised to know that there were some loyalists, some people who didn't like the idea of a boycott against British because they love their rulers. We have a much higher percentage of those people surrounding us today. And we posted over on our socials this morning a great quote from John Jay, who became the first Chief Justice. And he said, the knaves and fools are always in alliance. I'm just paraphrasing, but basically saying the bad guys and the idiots who follow them are always working together to destroy your liberty. And we certainly have a lot of that today, but they had that at the time. There was not universal support for resisting the British. Many people wanted to stay part of Britain. Many of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence thought that was only a very last resort. They weren't advocating for that some years earlier. James Otis Jr. certainly was not as well. So there were some loyalists who did not like this Continental Association, and a very widely read paper was published on November 16th by a guy, probably Samuel Seabury. It was called Free Thoughts on the Proceedings of the Continental Congress. And in response, a young Alexander Hamilton, a guy who later called for total unlimited centralized power in the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, he literally said, this is my paraphrase, but I would be happy to get rid of the states. They're a problem. But I know we can't do that. We won't. The rest of the people aren't ready for that, basically. So let's get what we can get. But I want to let you know what my goal is. He wanted unlimited power in all cases whatsoever. He used the exact same phrase that they used in the Declaratory Act. But here he is somewhere around, we don't know really, 17, 18, 19 years old. He wrote, this is one of his first published papers. And back when he was a young radical, man, really, where did this guy go? He wrote a 35-page response that defended the actions of the First Continental Congress. And he starts it out with this. Well, this is not the very beginning. He said, what then is the subject of our controversy with the mother country? What can actuate those men who labor to delude any of us into an opinion that the object of our contention between the parent state and the colonies is only 3d duty upon tea? Hamilton here is really taking the position that if you think we're just upset about a 3d tax, that is not the issue. It's the core underlying principle that they're claiming a power to do this in the first place. And as John Dickinson, of course, had warned, we know Hamilton had read his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania from 1767. Everybody studied that. They were super widely read. And we know that every time you establish a precedent, they're doing it to build upon it. Government doesn't just say, oh, well, you allowed us to do this small thing for an emergency. We're just going to stop there and it'll never get worse. If that was the case, the Patriot Act would have always been for the terrorists. The income tax would have been a temporary wartime measure, never been gone again. Just everything that they do really is always used as a precedent to expand. And that's what Dickinson called it in response to the Stamp Act, when he said you have to refuse to comply with this thing, otherwise you establish the detestable precedent, which those who have forged your fetters have ardently wished for. Again, off the top of my head, hopefully that's close. But anyways, Hamilton's taking this position that, whoa, I mean, we're not just upset about this 3d tax. We're upset. We've got a problem with the issue, the underlying principle that you claim this power over us in all cases whatsoever. And he points this out. He said, the Parliament claims a right to tax us in all cases whatsoever. Its late acts are in virtue of that claim. So he's pointing out that the Tea Act is really just an outgrowth of the Declaratory Act. How ridiculous then, how ridiculous, he did not hold back. How ridiculous then is it to affirm that we are quarreling for the trifling sum of 3d a pound on tea, when it is evidently the principle against which we stand. So then he went through a bunch of, well, hold on. The only scheme, he points out that the opposition is basically saying you should not do non-importation. You should not do a boycott. You should not stop sending your stuff overseas. Basically, everything that the Continental Association was signing on for, had unanimous support. Everything that they're doing, this is wrong. The only thing you're authorized to do in response to the king's choice, through the king and parliament, of course, final authority and sovereignty they believed were within themselves, and the people said, the colonists were saying, well, no, power flows from the people, and you are basically working for us. So these are two conflicting views over the power of government. Of course, there's going to be a conflict over time, but they were saying the only thing you're authorized to do is basically ask. Ask them to stop doing what they're doing. This is how, unfortunately, most people today, again, treat the largest government in history. They say, well, we have power because we can vote the bums out. But in essence, what you're doing is you're hoping that the people in power do the right thing once they're getting power. Or you sue a court in the hopes that part of the system will tell another part of the system that they should have been doing what they've been doing all along. This is really very similar. Now, there are some differences in degree, but certainly it's about asking the government to stop doing what government was never supposed to do. And Hamilton was like, this is dumb. If you've heard me cite him from Federalist number 33, where he was talking about the supremacy clause, and he said, look, if their acts are not in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution, these are just merely acts of usurpation and deserve to be treated as such. And that's the mentality that he had as a young revolutionary. I think he certainly flipped the switch to something. I got to look into this and understand this. I'm not a Hamilton historian by any stretch of the imagination, but his early writings were really, really, really good stuff. And then he really went another direction. Anyways, the only scheme of opposition, he writes, suggested by those who have been and are averse from a non-importation and non-exportation agreement is by remonstrance and petition. So he's basically saying the only thing we can do is really just ask. Just ask. But he says, upon the whole, it is morally certain this mode of opposition would be fruitless and defective. Because why? He says, what can we represent to these people which we have not already said? What petitions can we offer that we have not already sent? If you think about all the writing that had been done, going all the way back, really, if we're talking about primarily the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, and beyond, they had already been making their case that the British didn't have this power over and over and over. There's only so many times that you can wave documents at people with power and expect them to really do the right thing. If you want to do it once, maybe. Lysander Spooner had a great take on this. I can't remember if this was in his essay on the trial by jury in 1852 or Defense for Fugitive Slaves in 1850. But basically he said, tyrants care nothing for discussions. Words do nothing to stop these people. Tyrants care nothing for discussions as long as those discussions do nothing to interfere in the enforcement of their laws. And that's very similar to what we're getting here from Alexander Hamilton. He said, they are just absurd. He said, upon the whole, it is morally certain that this mode of opposition would be fruitless and defective. Asking the empire to stop being the empire is a waste of time. You have to come up with a way to thwart what they try to do and make it difficult for them to pull things off so that it's politically the right choice for them to stop doing the bad stuff, because governments just are governments. The exigency of the times, he says, requires vigorous and probable remedies, not weak and improbable. It would therefore be the extreme of folly to place any confidence in, much less confine ourselves wholly to it. Now, all this stuff is going to be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley does an awesome job getting a blog post organized for every single episode. You'll find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones, YouTube and X. We live stream on Facebook and Twitch and LinkedIn, but I love live streaming over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. Lots of great feedback, lots of great commentary going on in the live chat and afterwards on both of those platforms. Thank you so much for being there, or wherever platform is best for you. We also have the audio-only podcast edition all over the place, but Alan will get that organized. Plus, for every episode on the blog post, there's a section that says show links. There's a lot of source documents, other episodes, articles, etc. for this one. So you really want to read in context on your own time if you want to get a full grasp of this. Hamilton's paper, man, I don't normally recommend reading a lot of Hamilton, but this was really, really good. So Hamilton then goes through this whole list of reasons why the opposition is morally sound, and then he gets back to the important strategy question, these three key elements. I'll get to that in a moment. I do want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone in the live chat. Again, I appreciate you being here. Welcome to the show. Thank you. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. There's Howard Clegg and Kirk Morrison, Cheriton Farmer, Dixie Strong, Haji, John, Ruben, Melody. I think, Kirk, I've said you already. I appreciate you being here. King Nobody, Silver Mine, and everyone else. Murray Ray, thank you all for being here again. Czar, Salt Lakers, Alan Hughes. I'll look through this a little bit later today and see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to. I appreciate all the feedback. I get tons of great ideas from your thoughts and comments, so thank you so much. Anyways, let's get back to this. So Hamilton went through this whole list of reasons why the opposition, resistance, and noncompliance was a morally sound approach. But then he went to this. From these plain and indisputable principles. So he's saying it's morally sound to not comply with a bunch of stuff that they're not authorized to do in the first place. That is morally unsound for them to do in the first place. So he goes through that. But then he says, the mode of opposition we have chosen is reconcilable to the strictest maxims of justice. It remains now to be examined whether it also has the sanction of a good policy. So you can say, yes, in principle, this idea is very sound. But how do we get from where we are today to where we want to be? As Thomas Jefferson again said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. And Jefferson, again, right after passage of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, the very next day, he fires off a letter to James Madison, which I wish I had handy. But basically what he said to Madison was, here's a copy of what we passed. It was really formalizing or reaffirming the principles of nullification as the rightful remedy to acts outside the Constitution. And he said we should affirm all the important principles they contain, so really be vocal about our principles, but at the same time, we should only push as far as events will render prudent, because if you push too far and you get nothing done, what does that change? I mean, it may sound great to talk tough online about how people are going to do this and this and this, but if you can't really think about how you're going to implement it and get from point A to point Z, from where we are today, the largest government in history, to a real land of the free, then you're not having good strategy. And I think most people miss the good strategy part a lot. And here, Hamilton was very influential with this, I think. He said, to render it agreeable to good policy, 3 things are requisite. Here's our 3 keys once again, 3 key elements. First, that the necessity of the times requires it. Second, that it be not the probable source of greater evils. And 3, than those it pretends to remedy. And lastly, that it have a probability of success. So he goes through each of these, and I'm going to only just highlight a few pieces from this because you really should just read this in full if you want to get kind of the backstory of how he was analyzing these 3 key elements and what they did in the Continental Congress and the Continental Association against the Coercive Acts. If you want to get into all that nitty-gritty, that'll be linked to in the show notes. But here's what he said. He said, the necessity of the times demands it needs but little elucidation. We are threatened with absolute slavery. Again, this is a reference to the total power of the Declaratory Act, unlimited power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever, which is what he's saying is absolute slavery. And then we have to wonder, why did he want to put the people of the several states under that same system in 1787? But he did. He said it has been proved that resistance by means of remonstrance and petition would not be efficacious, and of course, that a restriction on our trade is the only peaceable method in our power. Again, this is the only peaceable method that we have. That doesn't mean there couldn't be other ones. He was just, again, recognizing what the events of the day were setting up for them. That's just what Jefferson was saying in response to the Alien Sedition Acts when Hamilton probably hated him. He's saying we have to push as far as events will render prudent. If we just like charge into things and ram our face into a wall, that doesn't accomplish much. Anyways, he said, it is the only peaceable method in our power to avoid the impending mischief. It follows, therefore, that such a restriction is necessary. And of course, again, like I was saying, this does again reference when he talks about this absolute slavery, he's talking about unlimited power in the Declaratory Act in all cases whatsoever. So then he goes to the greater evils. He said that it is not the probable source of greater evils than those it pretends to remedy may easily be determined. The most abject slavery, which comprehends almost every species of human misery, is what it is designed to prevent. Again, if we're thinking about government enacting even a small measure, 3p measure, a tax, the idea that that is the precedent for the most abject slavery is a mentality that most people don't have today. So many people who claim to be supporters of the Second Amendment, of the right to keep and bear arms over the last few years, have basically laughed at us for pushing for nullification of the Trump stock ban of 2018. They said, oh, well, that's just a kiddie toy. I don't need that thing. Real gun people don't use those things. I don't care. I don't own one. I don't need one. Or maybe I do. But the idea that the government has the power to restrict any firearm, accessory, or ammunition means it will use that as a precedent to do more and more and more and have this dumb attitude that just because it's a small problem, it's not a problem at all. Dickinson, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, as a quick aside, he thought that the small attacks, the small precedents were the most dangerous ones because the real big ones often led to convulsions and a really aggressive resistance. The small ones, the people were too lazy. They would just say, oh, it doesn't affect me. No big deal. That's a kiddie toy, that bump stock. I don't need to resist government over this. And that's a really dangerous approach. So he's saying that the most abject slavery is what we're trying to prevent. And that's really what Thomas Paine was saying as well In the winter of 1776, after the fighting had already been going on for quite some time, he's saying we can't give up. We know, of course, they're making us some offers. There were some negotiations or like, hey, can we, come to terms on this? And Paine was saying, no way. As long as they have this declaratory act, not a chance. He said, Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then there is not such a thing as slavery upon earth. Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. So unlimited power, even if they don't exercise it, is what the founders were resisting. Now, anyways, back to Hamilton. He said, the evils which may flow from the execution of our measures, if we consider them with respect to their extent and duration, are comparatively nothing. Yes, it will be an inconvenience because they were relying heavily on imports and the trade, and commerce is a very important part of prosperity. So it's, in other words, he said, this should still be a no-brainer. Is this going to be a greater evil than allowing them the power to control us? Absolutely not. And then, of course, he gets down to the last part, the policy of a measure and its probability of success. And he goes through quite a bit on this. But this summary of it, I think, is really, really a great response. He says, the omnipotence and all sufficiency of Great Britain may be pretty good topics for her passionate admirers to exercise their declamatory powers upon us for amusement and trial of skill. So he's basically shaming. I mean, this is, he's making fun of the idea that the people who say, don't do this because they're all powerful. They are total power. They have total power. They have omnipotence. They are totally self-sufficient. Who cares what you people, you petty idiots do? Don't do it. Don't try. They will destroy you. He's like, this is laughable. Okay, you may love this and try to sound awesome, but it's pretty absurd. He said, but they ought not to be proposed to the world as matters of truth and reality. In the calm, unprejudiced eye of reason, they are altogether visionary. And as to her wealth, because that was one of the arguments being made, they're so rich and powerful that just a little trade boycott isn't going to hurt them at all. And he went through some examples of how it certainly would, and how, of course, we know that it worked against other tax acts. He said, as to her wealth, it is notorious that she is oppressed with a heavy national debt. And we should think about this as well when we think about our opposition to the largest empire in history once again. They are burdened with a heavy national debt. And as the anti-federalist Brutus told us in 1788, maybe it was 87, he said specifically, I can't think of a worse situation that can befall this country than to be loaded with a debt that they could never discharge. So the worst situation that they can have is to have this much debt. It is dangerous to national security, George Washington told us. But anyways, as to her wealth, it is notorious that she is oppressed with a heavy national debt, which it requires the utmost policy and economy ever to discharge. He talks about luxury. The people are just kind of living high on the hog, I guess the phrase would be. Her subjects are also loaded with the most enormous taxes. All circumstances agree in declaring their distress. So he's pointing out, you may think these people are all powerful, but they're propping the system up on debt and taxes. And as James Madison told us some years later, armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. So are they really all that powerful, or is it more like a house of cards? Now, we do hear this kind of omnipotence argument. They've got all the guns. Don't try. Don't resist them. You're just going to end up in jail. And if they weren't working for the feds when they tell us this, they sound like they do. They have the same argument. Don't do anything because they'll destroy you. They'll crush you. And that was the title of another episode that I'm going to reference in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Don't try. They'll crush you. I covered in that episode some interesting examples of early resistance, early following not our nullification strategy, us following theirs, but early examples of what we try to implement today to resist the most powerful government in history and to nullify their unconstitutional acts into oblivion where they belong, response to the whiskey tax, response to Jefferson's embargo, Madison's War of 1812. And it's a really, really interesting episode. Maybe it's a real wonky like this one, but we also cover it in detail in our annual State of the Nullification Movement report, which will be linked to in the show notes as well. It's a free download, like 150 pages, going into much more detail on this strategy, the foundational principles. But then the second part of the book is how it's being implemented today. So it's a very important and powerful stuff. So then Hamilton goes through a number of pages. Again, this is a 35-page document going through how the trade restrictions will impact the British. And the British probably, I don't think he actually said this, but I think the British probably recognize that this is the case because their response to this type of a measure was to really just get more aggressive. They really pushed forward with their gun control program throughout the fall of 1774. I've got another episode on that I don't have handy. And of course, we know Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world. The rest is history. I think the British were like, oh man, they already resisted us against the Stamp Act and kind of won. We slapped back with this declaratory act. So we tried to put more taxes. And we tried some small ones. They also resisted that against the Townshend Acts. And then we tried again with tea. Then they resisted that. Then we shut down their port. Now they're all the colonies. It's not just those Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who, of course, we want to ship off to London and probably hang them for treason. It's all the colonies are joining in to resist us. Man, we got to do something. And I think that's the way the British approach this. So with these three key elements from, of all people, Alexander Hamilton, a young revolutionary, again, just to reiterate this. One, the necessity of the times requires it. And I think if we're thinking about basically all unconstitutional acts, they all set a precedent for more unconstitutional acts. We already live under the largest government in history. The necessity of the times requires some kind of strategy in opposition to basically anything and everything that they do. That's why I think sometimes it's so difficult, because it's so overwhelming, the tens of thousands of laws, rules, orders, and regulations that are on the books, and they keep adding to them. But as long as people keep using the federal government as the strategy to stop the federal government through courts and voting bums out and protests, government's never going to stop doing this. That's a separate episode. So the necessity of the times requires something. It can't be the probable source, number two, of creating a greater evil. So does not complying with a bump stock ban make it worse than allowing them the power to actually ban another firearm accessory? Redefine the definition of a type of a firearm into something that they didn't have the authority to ban in the first place or restrict in the first place. Of course, it's much worse to allow them because, as we've seen in recent years, we should learn. Well, of course, they tried to do the same thing on other stuff. They've been keep expanding this. And then it also has to have a probability and not just a possibility of success. So to say, oh, we're going to I don't know. I'm trying to think of some of the crazy things people have told us over and over and over. But if you just have to start thinking about, can we get a win on the board? It's essential to get some W's, especially in the situation that we face today. So how do you get there? How do we get from point A to point B? Is this practical, or are we just talking out of our asses? And speaking of asses, this is maybe this has got, at least as of today, this is my favorite quote from the height of the revolution. And surprisingly, it comes from Alexander Hamilton. It'll change probably from day to day, but here's how he puts it. He says, "Before I conclude this part of my address, I will answer two very singular interrogatories proposed by the farmer." This is not John Dickinson. This is Samuel, the guy who wrote the opposition to the Continental Congress. This is the position that the farmer took. "Can we think," says he, "to threaten and bully and frighten the supreme government of the nation into a compliance with our demands? Can we expect to force submission to our peevish and petulant humors by exciting clamors and riots in England?" So that was the argument. Like, can we even fathom this all-powerful, super rich, mother country supreme government? Can we even think that we can force them to bend their knee to us? And that's That is the exact argument we get in response from people who don't want us to push forward with the Defend the Guard Act, restricting the use of National Guard troops in active duty combat without a declaration of war as required by the Constitution, declaration of war from Congress as required by the Constitution. They tell us, oh, what are you going to do? You think you can force them to change their national defense policy? No, that's not the case. What we're saying is we're not going to participate in this, and we're not going to just back down when you tell us everything that we're supposed to be doing. And that's what Alexander Hamilton, he said here as well. No, gentle sir. We neither desire nor endeavor to threaten, bully, or frighten any persons into a compliance with our demands. We have no peevish and petulant humors to be submitted to. All we aim at is to convince your high and mighty masters, the ministry, that we are not such asses as to let them ride us as they please. And maybe you see why that's my favorite one of the revolution, at least as of today. That's the Hamilton we really needed in 1787 through 1791 and 2, but he certainly was gone. But if we take this attitude that we will not let them ride us as we please, eventually we're going to break through and really get on the right path to liberty. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope it was fun to watch or listen to. I can't thank you enough for spending some of your time with me today. If you want to help us get this kind of message out to more and more people, nothing helps us roll up our sleeves every single day and do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. No pressure, but nothing helps us do this work more. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please go over to 10thamendmentcenter.com/members and consider throwing a few bucks our way. We also have annual 5-year and lifetime options. Thank you again for watching. I'll have to take a look in the chat a little bit later today or tomorrow to see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com, all spelled out. I don't reply to too many, but I do get to see all your comments and feedback, and I really, really appreciate it. Again, I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for watching the show. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.